Welcome to day 12 of ATMOS 2750. We're going to continue our tour of world energy, this time focusing in on how we generate electricity, and then looking specifically at coal, hydropower, nuclear, renewables, which are basically solar and wind power, and also biofuels. Once again, I'm taking the presentation from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, and the link for that is actually at the bottom of this. So let's look at regional electricity generation. If we look at North America, the bar on the left, the dominant way that we get our electricity is actually through natural gas and coal. If you put those two together, it's slightly more than 50% of our electricity comes from fossil fuels. And then we have about 45% or so that's coming from a combination of nuclear power, hydropower, and renewables. And renewables and hydropower are about equal. In South America, there's a dominance of hydropower, mainly because of the water that's available through the Amazon basin. In Europe, they have more renewables than any fraction of energy from renewables. They also have a significantly more amount of energy that comes from nuclear, primarily through France. The renewable in Europe that's actually driving this is actually solar power, and Germany has invested very heavily in solar power throughout much of the country. And that's part of that, what's driving that. The old Soviet bloc countries, the CIS, is really being dominated by natural gas and coal, even more so than in North America. Middle East, obviously, is just using oil and gas, and Asia Pacific is primarily focusing in on just using coal. Africa, which is very resource poor, imports what it can and does some hydro, which is the one resource that it does have, but mostly it's just importing from other locations where it can get oil, gas, and coal from different places. If we look at the share of global electricity generation by fuel, then what we can see is that coal is the dominant generator of electricity around the world. In the late 1980s, it was generating about 37% of electricity, and that has seen a decline in the last few years, down to about 34-35%. So coal is decreasing, as is oil. Oil is not typically burned to create electricity. The other thing that's going down is nuclear energy as older plants are being phased out. And to make up for the slack, since hydropower is basically flat, there's been an increase in natural gas and an increase in renewables. And you'll notice that the increase in renewables is an exponential increase. So it's going to start to take over and will eventually become the dominant source of energy for electric generation. If we look specifically at coal, like we did for oil and natural gas, you can look at the reserve to production ratio for North America, and that is in excess of 450 years. We do have a lot of coal, that's true, but our rate at which we're extracting the coal from the ground has started to decrease significantly, which has led to an increase in the reserve to production ratio. The Asia Pacific region has a lot of coal as well, but they're extracting it much faster. And so their reserve to production ratio is only about 75 to 80 years, sort of thing. Here we can see the history of the reserve to production ratio, and this kind of tells the story that I was talking about for North America. The light green line, basically in 2000 we had a reserve to production ratio of about 250, and as we slowed down our extraction, our reserve to production ratio doubled to about 500. When it comes to Europe, they also are decreasing their reliance upon coal, and as a result, their reserve to production ratio went from below 100 to over 300. And then you have the Asia Pacific region, which is just burning their coal as fast as they can, and their reserve to production ratio has decreased from, about 170 down to about 80 years. Here we are looking at the total coal reserves known from year 2000, 2010, and 2020. And the first thing to note is that the total tonnage available of coal really hasn't changed. That means we're not doing exploration for coal in the way that we're doing exploration for oil and natural gas. And as a result, the distribution of coal reserves really hasn't changed that much. Asia Pacific still has the most coal in the world, followed by North America and then Eurasia. This is the really scary plot. It shows the coal production by region and the coal consumption by region. So ignoring the yellow, which is basically China and other Asian Pacific countries, and you just look at all the other regions, it looks like coal has primarily been decreasing, especially over the last 5 years, while the amount of coal that is produced and consumed has been increasing in the Asian Pacific region. And if you look at the year 2020, it looks like about 80% of the world's consumption of coal is being done in the Asia Pacific region, which is just absolutely astounding. If we look at hydropower, once again, ignore the yellow, which is Asia Pacific, and focus in on everything else. And what the story tells here is that hydropower really isn't changing much in most of the world. The exception is Asia Pacific, where there have been additional dams that have been built. The largest, of course, was the Three Gorges Dam in China, which is the largest hydro reservoir in the world. And that significantly increased the capacity for hydropower in the Asian region. If we look at nuclear, starting off with North America, it's been largely flat for most of the last 25 years, but that's about to change as most of the nuclear power plants are nearing end of life and they're going to have to be taken offline, and there are not plans to replace them at this point with nuclear power. Europe is also seeing a slight decline in consumption and generation of nuclear energy due to similar concerns with aging facilities and not knowing what to do with the high-level radioactive waste that comes from those facilities. China has not really increased their nuclear capacity over any significant amount, but overall, nuclear is just kind of humming along, not really increasing, and if anything, there's likely to be a slight decline in nuclear over the next decade. If we look at renewables, specifically here, solar and wind, you'll see that more than half of all of the renewable energy generation is currently by wind, but solar is actually growing much faster than wind, in part because of the investment that China has made in the development of the photovoltaic cells. And solar power is now cheaper than wind, and wind is now cheaper than coal. So there's actually an economic incentive toward moving towards renewables as well. And you can definitely see this exponential growth in renewables. And it's predicted that this exponential growth will continue for at least the next decade or two as we ramp up and try and replace the loss of nuclear power and then later on replacing coal. If we look at who's consuming renewable energy, it's about equal between North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. There's not much renewable in terms of solar and wind in Africa or even in South America for the most part, and almost none in the old Soviet republics in the Middle East. If we look at biofuel, what is biofuel? Well, biofuel is basically taking plant material and turning it into fuel that can be then combusted in vehicles. And the two primary ones that are listed here are ethanol and biodiesel. And in the United States, we turn corn into ethanol. It's kind of interesting that we take a food crop and turn it into a fuel that we can then burn in our cars when people are starving around the world. But if the next time you go to the gas station, I want you to notice two things. One, is there ethanol in your gasoline? You'll see a sticker that says, generally speaking, that this gasoline may contain up to 10% ethanol if you are at a regular unleaded gasoline station. The other thing I want you to look at is there'll be a sticker on the pump that will tell you how much you're paying in terms of taxes for state and federal taxes. And you might be surprised at how much of that money that you're spending per gallon of gas is actually going for taxes and not necessarily for the product itself. So when it comes to biofuels, there's been a significant increase in biofuel production since the early 2000s. The reduction in biofuel in the year 2020 is more likely related to the pandemic than it is to a trend or a starting of a new trend. In North America and Central America, and South and Central America, the primarily producing ethanol. In North America, we're using corn. In South America, they're using a non-food crop to do it, sort of thing. And that's different than how Europe and Asia have focused in on trying to generate biofuel, in that they've been focusing in on generating biodiesel fuel.